Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining me right now is former U.N. Ambassador John Bolton. Mr. Bolton also served several Republican administrations in the State Department. It's good to talk to you again, sir.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
It's our pleasure. Let's start with a story that CBS News broke late last week. They uncovered documents showing the State Department may have covered up allegations of misconduct and illegal activities, including an underground drug ring, sexual assaults, and the hiring of prostitutes by members of Hillary Clinton's detail. Based on everything else that we've heard about the State Department recently, how much damage control do they have to do, and how much worse can things get?
Well, I think there's a significant amount of trouble for the State Department here, and potentially for former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in particular. You know, the New York Post has carried the story forward, revealing, for example, that it was they allege anyway that it was U.S. Ambassador to Belgium Howard Gutman who, according to the IG report, ditched his security detail frequently and went after prostitutes. Now, Gutman denies that vigorously, but the issue seems to be whether the investigation by the Diplomatic Security Bureau was quashed by higher-ups. They say the Inspector General at the State Department says Gutman was talked to by Undersecretary for Management Patrick Kennedy, who was very much involved in the Benghazi affair, but he was sent back to his post. There's also a story that Cheryl Mills, the Chief of Staff to former Secretary Clinton, intervened in another investigation involving alleged improprieties, and that the person who was the subject of the investigation there was then nominated to be U.S. Ambassador to Iraq. That nomination cratered when the subject of the investigation came out. But when you add all this together, you know, it in a way, it doesn't surprise me. The culture of the State Department is very self-protective, but having investigation after investigation quashed really raises a lot of questions about what's going on. And I have a feeling this is, I've lost count of how many scandals we've got going at the moment, but this one, you know, on a clear day, this would be a scandal big enough to rock any administration, and I think it'll have its impact here.
It is hard to get your arms around all this, but as you mentioned, there were folks very close to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time who may have known about this. Based on what you've seen so far, do you think there's any way that she may have not known?
Well, you know, this goes directly to a style of management that Hillary Clinton used, where it's very hard to find her fingerprints or direct conversations. It's always this chief of staff. This was true in the case of Benghazi. You'll recall the testimony before Congress a month or so ago of the #2 American in Libya at the time of the 9/11 attack, who said he was called by Cheryl Mills, Hillary's chief of staff, and told not to meet with visiting members of Congress without a State Department lawyer being present. And I think people who have been in the State Department in the Obama administration would confirm that Cheryl Mills is not an independent actor. She is Secretary Clinton's, or was Secretary Clinton's, consigliere. When she speaks, she's speaking for the Secretary. So, you know, it may look like a way to keep the Secretary's fingerprints off this, whether it's Benghazi or this allegation involving the nominee to be American ambassador to Iraq, but I think it goes right back to the Secretary's office door, and very hard to see how it doesn't end up right on her desk.
So we'll continue to watch this, you know, of course, as we hear more about Hillary Clinton's political aspirations for the future. I do want to move on and talk a little bit about the NSA leaks and some of the newer information that we're learning now. I heard you mention recently that one of the real issues with the way this is being handled, at least from a PR and management standpoint, is President Obama's inability to understand how the executive branch works. Last week we spoke with Newt Gingrich, who said this, the IRS scandal and some of the other scandals we've heard so much about really shows how the federal government is too big and unmanageable. What's your take?
Well, I think it is big and excessively large and too intrusive. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But, you know, whether it's unmanageable depends in part on the president. And I think this is a real failing of Barack Obama, who, before becoming elected, president had never managed anything bigger than a Senate office. And it almost seems like he doesn't even know where part of his federal government is. I'm wondering, really, if he understood or paid attention when he was being told about these various NSA programs. He seems to think being president means giving speeches and going to political fundraisers and not running the executive branch of the government. That's what the Constitution says is the president's principal obligation, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, as Article 2 says. So I don't think the government is unmanageable, except when you have a president who doesn't seem to want to trouble himself with what goes on beyond the confines of the Oval Office. And I think that's something that's very worrying, and I think it's going to come back to bite us. I think one of the reasons you see the kind of scandals that we do is the White House's hands-off attitude. Oh, well, that's in the Internal Revenue Service. That's not anything I can do anything about. Or, well, that's over in the Justice Department, so I'm not going to get into that. Or, well, that's a State Department matter. Who's in charge? You know, in Harry Truman's day, he had that famous sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." And some humorist, I wish I could take credit for this, says that on Barack Obama's desk in the White House is a sign that says, "The buck accelerates here."
Well, we've heard other examples of that, of something similar, and that the era maybe of the buck stopping with the president is over. But we're also hearing a lot of folks in Washington and elsewhere use the word traitor in reference to the leaker Edward Snowden. But on the other hand, former Congressman Ron Paul says Snowden did a great service to the nation here. Paul, of course, is a libertarian-leaning Republican. We've heard a lot of other libertarians say similar things. Are these people being too simplistic in their assessment of these NSA leaks, and are they maybe trying to take political advantage of this situation? Or do they have a point?
I think they're certainly simplistic. The man is a traitor. This is an act of war against the United States in the Constitution's definition. You know, treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. And it talks about waging war against the United States, which this is, and in giving aid and comfort to their enemies, to our enemies. And God knows they've gotten a lot of aid and comfort from this release. Let's look at this fellow Snowden. He's a deceitful and dishonest man. He signed oaths to get these jobs that said you're going to be given sensitive, classified information, and you have to swear that you're not going to disclose it. So he took those oaths, he got the job, and then he violated the oaths. So I think that cast doubt on his credibility across the board. And by the way, he says he makes these disclosures because it bothered his conscience that the NSA was running these programs. Let me ask, who died and made him king? Who gave him the authority to endanger 300 million Americans? That's not the way it works. And if he thinks he can get away with that, I think he's got another thing coming.
Yeah, that's an important question to ask. You know, in extreme cases of treason in the past, the penalty for that is death. Do you think this is an example of where the death penalty could be applicable?
Well, my guess is, and this is, of course, speculation, that the Justice Department will not charge him with espionage in the extradition request. And given the Obama administration's views about the death penalty, my guess is they won't ask for it. But I would say this, I think he needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible. And if he gets a jail sentence, it ought to be about 5 life terms running consecutively.
All right, so a Pew Research poll shows that 60% of Americans favor these kinds of programs. About 40% find them unacceptable. What does this tell us, though, about the current state of our liberty compared to security and public opinion?
Well, I think that the American people understand that we are threatened, not just by terrorists, but, for example, by China's incredible cyber warfare capabilities. The Chinese have hacked into the top 1,000 American corporations. They've been all through the U.S. government. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it has its upsides and its downsides, and America needs to be defended. I think that's what people say. I think they see here that these programs that the NSA is running, to the extent we understand them, and there's a lot we don't understand, have been reviewed by lawyers in the executive branch. They're programs that were approved by Congress and that have been briefed to Congress on a regular and periodic basis. And when searches of the data have been made with respect to individual Americans, search warrants have been approved by Article III judges. So, you know, our framers thought 3 branches of government were about right for the government, and all 3 branches have approved the operation of this program. So those who oppose it need to tell me, well, what other branch do you want involved? You smarter than the framers? All 3 branches have agreed with this. Now, they're not perfect because they're just human, but who's going to do better than that? And I think until we hear the answer to that question, people ought to calm down, take a deep breath, and think about what technology can do to make us safer. And I think that's what the reason this program started in the Bush administration, continued, refined, and even expanded by the Obama administration. It's very different from the scandals involving the IRS and Benghazi that we've seen, where the president really is accused of using the power of government for political purposes. Here, the power of government's being used to protect innocent American civilians. I think it's a very different situation.
It certainly appears that way, and a sign of the times that we live in today. Ambassador John Bolton, a pleasure talking with you, sir, and thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.